Nobody warned her that cowboys love harder than any man she'd known. She kept her money in her left boot. I noticed that the first day, when she stepped off the stage and one heel caught wrong on the step, and she reached down without thinking, patting the outside of that boot before she caught herself. Looked up and saw me watching. Didn't flinch, didn't color. Just looked back at me like she was deciding whether I was a threat or a convenience. Turned out I was neither. I had come to meet the stage because Clay Dobbins had wired me from Santa Fe that a woman would be arriving. A woman who'd worked for him at the Gem for 2 seasons, and whom he trusted enough to recommend to me. I needed someone to keep the books at the Rafter H. I had 60 head of cattle, 12 horses, a bunkhouse of 7 men, and handwriting like a fence post in a flood. Every month I paid Ned Farnsley $2 to come out from town and square my ledgers, and every month I hated the way he sat at my table, licking his pencil, making small sounds of disapproval. So I'd wired Clay, and Clay had sent Elsa Voss. She was maybe 35, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looks like it has been through weather and come out the other side still handsome. She carried 1 trunk and a brown leather satchel, and she did not wait for me to offer my hand before she offered hers. "You're Harlan Kett," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Clay says you run a clean operation." "I try to." She looked at the street, at the raw wooden storefronts of Calla Ford, at the 2 drunks already arranging themselves against the feed store wall, though it was not yet noon. She looked at the sky, which was white and hot, and offered nothing. "All right," she said. That was the whole of our introduction. I drove her out in the wagon. 14 miles of alkali flat and then a slow rise into the first real grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek, and the Rafter H sitting in a bend of the land like it had grown there. I'd built the main house myself, 12 years prior, with my brother Walt and 2 Mexicans from Chihuahua whose names I am ashamed to say I have half forgotten. Adobe and log both. It sat low and thick-walled against the heat. There was a porch facing west so I could watch weather come. She looked at it and nodded, like it confirmed something. I showed her the office, a room off the main house, a desk, a lamp, 2 filing boxes crammed with loose paper, a shelf of ledger books, and a smell of old ink and mice. She set her satchel on the desk, unclipped it, and withdrew a pair of spectacles in a slim brass case. Opened the nearest ledger, studied it for 30 seconds. "Clay was right," she said. "You need help." That's what I told him. "I'll need a week to inventory what's here. Then I'll tell you what your actual situation is versus what you think it is." I thought my situation was clear enough. She looked at me over the spectacles. "You've been underpaying your water rights since 1897, and you overpaid Ned Farnsley by $14 last spring." I had no answer to that. She turned back to the ledger. I went back outside. The bunkhouse men reacted to her the way men usually do to a woman who makes it plain she is not there for them. Some went respectful and quiet. One, Dooley, a young hand from Arkansas, went foolish and loud until I took him aside and explained that Mrs. Voss was not a fixture of the place, but a professional I'd hired, and he would treat her accordingly, or he would be rolling his bedroll inside a week. He settled. What I had not expected was how she would move through my days. Not intrusively. She was never underfoot, never demanding. She ate with me in the main house because I'd offered and she'd accepted, and we talked about the work, what she'd found that morning, what the water rights situation actually meant, whether the 3rd pasture was worth the fencing cost. She had opinions. She stated them plainly, and when I pushed back, she either held her ground with reasons or changed her position without embarrassment. I had not had that kind of conversation since my wife Ellen died. Ellen, I had not let myself think that sentence since Ellen died without it doing a certain amount of damage. It had been 4 years. I'd thought by now it would be different. Some men told me it got different. What I had found was it got quieter, the same way a field gets quiet after a fire. Things grow back, but not the same things. I was not looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I was not one of those men who hires a widow and begins angling. I had hired her to do a job. She was doing it, and my feelings on the matter were limited to gratitude and the mild surprise of having regular, intelligent conversation again. Whatever started was not my doing. I'm not sure it was hers either. Some things don't have a doer, they just come on like weather. It was the 3rd week when I understood something had shifted. I'd come in from mending fence on the north section, 12 hours out, hands cut, shirt soaked through twice and dried, the kind of tired that sits in the bones. I came into the main house, and she had left a plate covered with a cloth on the back of the stove, and the lamp was turned down low in the office, and I could hear her moving in there, the small sounds of pages, a pen laid down, a drawer opened and closed. I stood in the kitchen with the plate, and I thought, this is what a house is supposed to sound like. I had not thought that in 4 years. I ate standing at the counter. I did not want to examine the thought too closely. I carried the plate to the basin and washed it and set it to dry and went to bed. But it was there in the morning when I woke, the way a thing sometimes sits waiting for you, the fact of it, that I had missed this. Not any particular woman, not any particular conversation. Just the fact of another person in the house who was worth something, who had her own weight and substance and competence, and who was not leaving. Or hadn't left yet. She had a 2-month contract. We were at 3 weeks. Let me tell you what I knew about her by then. It was not much. She did not offer information about herself, and I did not ask. That is the courtesy of the frontier, or at least it was the courtesy I knew. What I had gathered was, she was a widow, her husband had been in the mining business, there had been some kind of catastrophe, financial or possibly literal, I was not certain, and she had come out west from Ohio, where she'd been raised and had learned to keep books for Clay Dobbins, who despite his appearance was a careful businessman, and from whom she had learned most of what she knew. She sent a letter twice a month on the stage. I did not know to whom. She read in the evenings. She had a silver bracelet on her right wrist that she never took off, even when she washed her hands at the kitchen basin. I knew she was careful, precise, that she had a low tolerance for sloppiness in ledgers or in people, but that she was not mean about it, just direct. I knew she was not afraid of silence. We could sit on the porch in the evenings after supper, she with her book, me with whatever needed mending, harness, a length of rope, a shirt button, and neither of us speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. I knew she watched me work sometimes, not in a way that announced itself. I'd catch the edge of it, her standing at the office window when I was in the yard, the angle of her attention. She would look away when she saw that I'd seen, without any show of embarrassment, just as a thing redirected. What I did not know was what any of it meant. I was 61 years old. I had been a rancher for 30 years and a husband for 12 before Ellen got sick. I knew cattle and grass and weather and a fair amount about men. I did not know much about what a woman's attention meant when it was given quietly, without a statement, the way hers came. I thought she is observing the operation, doing her job thoroughly. I thought she is a careful person, and careful people observe everything. I thought other things, which I did not let myself finish. The trouble with Dodd Wharton started in the 5th week. Wharton ran the box W, which bordered my east fence. He was not a bad man, exactly, not a man who would shoot you from behind or steal your horses. But he was the kind of man who took, consistently, whatever he thought he could take without consequence. He'd been grazing his cattle on my east pasture for the better part of 2 seasons, coming in under the fence where it sagged. And I had repaired that fence 3 times and spoken to him twice and gotten the polite nod and the insincere assurance both times. He also owed me $60 from a cattle deal 3 years prior. Elsa found that in the ledgers during her 2nd week. She wrote it up in a clean hand and left the page on my desk with a paper clip. When I came in that evening, she looked at me over her spectacles. "Wharton," I said, $60 and 4 months grazing damage by my estimate. Though the grazing damage requires a look at how long and how many head, and I'd want to verify my numbers. I've verified them well enough. Then you should address it. I've addressed it twice. She was quiet a moment. What happened when you addressed it? He was agreeable. And then nothing changed. She took her spectacles off, folded them. Then perhaps the next address needs to be less agreeable. I looked at her. She was not being impertinent. She was stating a business fact the way she stated all business facts, with the bluntness of someone who does not have the patience for what doesn't work. "Yes," I said, "I expect it does." I went to see Wharton the next morning. It did not go well. Or rather, it went the way things go when a man who has been accommodated too long finally hears the word *no and doesn't know how to receive it. Wharton got loud. He talked about old claims and old agreements, neither of which had any reality I could identify. and he talked about what a man's range was his range. And he made some reference to my being the kind of man who sent a woman to do his bookkeeping, which was the first time I understood that Elsa's presence had become a topic of conversation in California. I told him he had 2 weeks to square the $60 and move his fence line back to the survey mark, or I would take it to Judge Aldrich. He told me to go to hell. I came home in a cold mood. She was in the kitchen when I came in, standing at the stove, and she looked at my face and said nothing for a moment. "He didn't take it well," she said. "No." "What did he say?" I told her. The money, the fence, the general shape of it. I did not tell her the part about her being mentioned, about what Wharton had said, and what had sat in my chest since like a coal. She handed me a cup of coffee. Her hand was steady. "You'll go to Aldrich," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. I'll have the documentation ready by Friday. It'll be clean." "I know it will." She nodded and turned back to the stove. I sat down at the table and drank the coffee and looked at the back of her, at the set of her shoulders, at the way she moved efficiently in a space she had made hers over 5 weeks without making any fuss about it. And I thought, Wharton had said sent a woman to do his bookkeeping like it was a diminishment, like it was a sign of something lacking in me. And what I actually felt was that he had simply told me he was a fool. I had hired the best person I could find for a job I needed done. What that said about me seemed, in that moment, like something I could stand behind. She came with me to see Judge Aldrich. I had not asked her to. She had appeared at the wagon at 7 in the morning with the documentation folder under her arm and said, "You'll want me there in case there are questions about the numbers." Aldrich was in his 60s, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who had seen every variety of dispute in 30 years on the bench and had no patience for the ones that were simply about pride. He looked at Elsa when she entered, looked at her with the frank assessment of an old man who is not pretending, and then looked at me. "Your bookkeeper," he said. "Yes." He asked her 2 questions about the documentation. She answered both precisely. He turned to the papers. Wharton lost, which was the only outcome possible, and he came out of Aldrich's office looking at me with an expression I recognized. A man who has been beaten and who is deciding what to do with it. Some men swallow it and adjust. Some men carry it. Wharton, I thought, was going to carry it. In the street, on the way back to the wagon, Elsa walked at my shoulder, and I felt, without looking at her, the completeness of it. The whole of the morning, what she had brought to it, how it had gone. I stopped at the wagon. "Thank you," I said. She looked at me a moment. $60 and grazing rights. It's your ranch, Harlan. You were right to fight for it. "I know, but you made it possible to fight for it correctly." She was quiet. Then she climbed up to the wagon seat, and I climbed up beside her, and we drove home. I have played that moment back a number of times. The way she said your ranch, with something underneath it that I am not sure I can name. Not sentiment, but acknowledgement, like she saw what it had taken and was returning it to me undamaged. 6 weeks in, I found the journal. I was not looking for it. I had gone into the office to retrieve the deed to the north pasture for a conversation I needed to have with Aldrich, and I pulled open the wrong drawer, the bottom left, not the right, and there it was beneath a stack of folders. A small blue journal, the kind a woman might carry. Closed. It was hers unmistakably. I shut the drawer. I did not open it. I want to be clear about that, too. What I felt was not curiosity about its contents. What I felt was a sudden physical awareness. The way you feel when you realize a person has interior life separate from what you've seen. Private life. A place they go that is not visible. I had understood abstractly that Elsa Voss was not simply a ledger keeper who happened to occupy my house. But the journal made it particular, made her particular. I found the deed in the right drawer and left the office. That evening she was reading on the porch, and I sat down with my coffee, and we were quiet for a while, the way we were. The sun was going down into the grass, turning everything that color it turns out here orange and bronze, and a deep pink in the clouds over the mountains. A hawk circling something out in the pasture. After a while she closed her book, keeping her finger in the page. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Why are you here, on this particular piece of ground?" I thought about that. It was not a question I'd been asked in a long time. "My wife chose it," I said. "Ellen, we came out from Kansas together when we were young. She saw this land and she said this is where we stop, so we stopped. Elsa looked out at the grass. She had good eyes, she said. She did. A pause. Do you miss it, she said, the way it was with someone. I held the coffee cup. The hawk out there made one more circle and dropped behind the tree line. Yes, I said. It was the first time I'd said that plainly to anyone. The way it sat in the air between us was something I had to get used to. She nodded slowly. She was not offering sympathy, not the clucking kind, the kind that wants to fix you. She was just receiving it, holding it with some care. I do too, she said quietly, miss it. We sat with that a while. The sky went from orange to a kind of bloodless blue. The lamp in the office threw a yellow square on the porch boards. I did not say anything more. Neither did she. We went in when the moths started at the light, and I banked the stove, and she went to her room, and I went to mine, and I lay on my back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought. That is the most honest conversation I have had in 4 years. Wharton came on a Tuesday. I was out at the holding pen with Dooley and a hand named Felix, working a group of cattle that had come in from the North Summer pasture. Hot work, Dusty, the kind of thing you have to finish once you start or you lose the day. I heard the rider and looked up, and it was Wharton, and behind him 2 of his men, and behind them a 3rd man I didn't know. He reined up at the fence and looked at me over it. Cat, he said. I set down the sorting rod. I told Dooley and Felix to keep working, and I walked over to the fence. Wharton, you went to Aldrich? His voice had that particular quality, not quite threat, not quite complaint, the quality of a man who has been nursing something. I did. Made me look like a fool in front of the judge. Judge didn't need my help for that. His jaw moved. The men behind him were still. The 3rd man, the one I didn't know, was watching me with a kind of flat professional attention that I did not like. I'm going to ask you to reconsider the fence arrangement, Wharton said. The arrangement settled, Dodd. Aldrich settled it. I'm asking you to reconsider. The answer is no. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked past me toward the house. And something in that look, the specific direction of it, the calculation in it, made my stomach go cold. That bookkeeper of yours, he said, pretty woman to have around. I kept my voice level. Right out, Dodd. Just making an observation. Right out. He held my gaze another moment. Then he wheeled his horse, and the 3 men followed, and they went back down the road in a rise of dust, and I watched them go, and I stood there with something hard and specific gathered in me, like water behind a dam, waiting. I went straight inside. She was at the desk, of course, pen in hand. She looked up when I came in and read whatever was on my face. Wharton, she said. He came to the holding pen. And I told her all of it, including the way he'd looked toward the house. I watched her as I said it. She did not go pale or frightened, that was not her way. Her expression went careful and inward, the way it did when she was working out a problem. What are you thinking? She said. I'm thinking he doesn't have any law on his side, and he knows it, which means if he does something, it won't have any law in it either. Do you have a rifle? Several. Are the men reliable? Dooley would fall asleep on watch. Felix is solid. Martinez is solid. The others, Hewson and Brand, they're good workers, but they're not fighters. She nodded. She was tapping the pen very lightly against the desk, which I had learned was her thinking gesture. You should tell Sheriff Prout, she said. Prout isn't worth much. He doesn't need to be worth much. You need a record that Wharton came here and made a threat. That's not asking Prout to do anything hard. It's just asking him to write it down. That was the kind of thinking I had needed from her all summer and hadn't been able to name until it appeared. Cut through to the actual structure of a thing. Not what do we feel about this, but what does this actually require? I'll ride in tomorrow, I said. Today would be better. I rode in today. The next 3 days were quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't restful, that sits with its eyes open. I moved Felix to sleeping in the barn. I told the men what the situation was without dramatizing it. I rode the fence line each morning. I did not leave the property. Elsa kept working. That steadied me more than I would have expected. The ordinary sounds of the office, the pen, the pages, the drawer, continued, and against the silence of those 3 days they were a kind of anchor. things proceeding, a person persisting at her work. On the third night, I was on the porch late after she'd gone in, sitting in the dark with a rifle across my knees. The moon was up and everything was pale and very still. The horses in the corral moved sometimes. An owl in the cottonwoods, nothing else. I heard the door behind me open and her step on the boards, and she came and sat in the other chair. She'd brought a blanket and put it around her shoulders, and she sat there in the moonlight not saying anything. "You should sleep," I said. "I was reading. It's past 11. I know what time it is, Harlan." I looked out at the yard, the corral, the dark line of the cottonwoods. After a while she said, "Tell me about this land." "What about it?" "When you came here, what it was like." I thought about it. Grass so high you could lose a calf in it. Antelope. In the spring, flowers you don't see much anymore, blue ones in the low places where the water sat. Ellen wanted to paint them, but we didn't have any paints yet. I paused. I remember thinking we'd gotten to the edge of something, that west of us there wasn't anything mapped that meant anything to anyone back east. She was quiet. "That felt good," she said. "Yes, it felt like we'd earned the ground we were standing on." She pulled the blanket tighter. The moon moved a little in the sky, which is to say the earth moved, and the shadows of the cottonwoods moved with it, and I sat there with the rifle on my knees and the night going on around us. "I don't think I've ever earned ground," she said quietly. "I've occupied it, I've been in places, but earning, that's different." "You could earn it." She looked at me. "You have the capacity for it," I said. "You're not a woman who passes through." She held my eyes for a moment, then she looked back out at the yard. "No," she said, "I don't think I am." Wharton came back on the 5th day. Not with men, alone. He came to the house, which was different, came to the door, not the fence, not the holding pen. I heard him ride in, and I met him on the porch, and he looked at me, and he looked worse than he had at the holding pen. Thinner somehow. His eyes had the particular red of a man who has been drinking for days without sleeping much. "I want the 60, he said. "You owe me 60, Dodd, not the other direction." "That's not how I remember it." "I don't know what you remember. The judge remembers different." He looked at me and his face did something complicated, not anger exactly, not entirely. Something more like the face a man makes when he has been wrong for so long he has forgotten what right feels like. I had some sympathy for it, a small amount. "I've got a bad year," he said. "I know it, a lot of us have a bad year." "I can't pay the 60. "Then pay it in time." "Give me 2 months." He blinked. I do not think he had expected that. "What does your bookkeeper say about that?" he said, and this time it was without the edge in it that it had carried before. It was almost a genuine question. "She'd say to get it in writing." The ghost of something crossed his face, not a smile, not quite. He looked at the porch boards, he looked at the sky. "Aldrich," he said, "he's a fair man." "He is." Another silence. He put his hat on and took it off again. "The fence line is the fence line," he said. "I won't push that again." "Good." He nodded once and climbed back on his horse and rode away, and I watched him go, and this time the dust he raised was just dust, not a signal of anything else. I told Elsa over supper. She listened and ate, and when I was done she said, "Do you believe him?" "About the fence, yes." "The 60. "Mostly." 2 months in writing, then." "That's what I said." She set her fork down and folded her hands on the table. "That was well done." I looked at her, giving him the 2 months. "Yes, and the way you said it, from the sound of it. You gave him the terms, but you also gave him his dignity. That's harder." I hadn't thought of it as difficult. I just thought of it as how you had to handle men when they were broken. "He came to you," she said. "Not the other way around, that matters." "Does it?" "Yes, he could have come back with those men. He came alone instead." She paused. "You made that possible. However you've carried yourself through this, the way you've handled the ranch, the way you spoke to him, he came to the door instead of the fence." I sat with that. "I'm not sure that's because of me," I said. "Harlan," she looked at me with a directness I had grown to know and still wasn't entirely used to. "When are you going to stop being surprised that you're worth something?" The table was between us. The lamp was between us. The evening was coming down outside and the window showed the last light on the grass. I didn't have an answer for her. I used to wonder, she said more quietly, what kind of man owned a ranch out here and kept good books and treated his hands decently and built a house that faces west for the weather. She paused. Clay told me you were solid. Competent, decent, I thought those were adequate recommendations. She looked down at her hands. I did not think they were the beginning of a description. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, one of the horses in the corral moved and was still. Elsa, I said, I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. You're not making me uncomfortable. She looked up. Your contract ends in 3 weeks, I said. She nodded. I would like to revise it. Revise it. Extend it or change its terms if you're willing. She was quiet for a long time, which is what she did when she was thinking. Not stalling, not keeping me waiting on purpose. Genuinely considering. I had learned to respect that about her and not to push into it. What terms, she said. Whatever terms you'd consider fair. She looked at me for a moment, and the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. But in the direction of one, the direction she sometimes moved when something struck her as both true and absurd. That's not a business term, she said. No, I said, it's not. She did not give me an answer that evening. She cleared the plates and washed them and went to her room, and I sat at the table for a while. And then I went to bed and lay there in the dark, feeling the strange combination of things that were in me. Something wide open, which was unfamiliar, and something I recognized from 30-odd years ago, when Ellen and I had been young and just arrived on this land, and everything was ahead of us, and the uncertainty of everything ahead had been exciting and not frightening. I was 61 years old. I had been a widower for 4 years. I had a ranch and cattle and 7 men and $60 owed me by a neighbor who had finally come to his senses. I had a woman in the room down the hall who had, in 7 weeks, made my house into what it was supposed to be. I did not know what she would say. I knew that whatever she decided I would take without argument. She was not a woman to be pressed. She would decide what she decided, and she would tell me, and it would be the truth, which was the only thing I had ever wanted from anyone. I slept eventually. In the morning, she was at the stove when I came into the kitchen, and that was not unusual. What was unusual was that she had made not just coffee but actual breakfast, eggs and salt pork and biscuits, which she had not done before, the mornings being her reading time. She set a plate in front of me without comment. I ate. There are terms, she said, not looking up from the stove, that I'd want settled. Tell me. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her coffee cup, and I saw her face was composed but careful, the way she looked when she was about to be very accurate about something. I kept my husband's books too, she said. Before, I was very good at it and it didn't matter because he didn't want to know the numbers. He wanted to feel like the enterprise was working. He wanted the feeling, not the fact. When I told him the truth about the mine, about the debt, he was angry. Not at the debt, at me for saying so. I listened. I'm not interested in that again, she said, in being the person who sees clearly and has to pretend she doesn't. I know. You've listened to me. Every time I've brought you something, you've listened. I want to know, is that this situation, or is that you? It was a fair question, a real question. It's me, I said. The best I can tell, it's me. Your wife, she said. Were you like that with her, listening? I tried to be. I didn't always succeed, but I tried. She nodded slowly. She was looking at her coffee. What I feel, she said carefully, is that I have not been seen in a long time. Not by a man who also needed nothing from me but the work, and I don't entirely trust it yet. I'm not sure I trust my own reading of it. That's fair. But I'm not leaving in 3 weeks, she said, if that's what you're asking. I looked at her. She looked back at me over the coffee, with those direct eyes that never looked away from a thing, once they'd decided to look at it. That's what I was asking, I said. She set the coffee down and came to the table, and she put her hand on my shoulder. Not on my face, not tender in the way stories make tender things, just her hand on my shoulder, the weight of it, the warmth, the plainness of it. I put my hand over hers. We stayed like that for a while, with the morning coming through the kitchen window and the biscuits going cold on my plate and the day just beginning outside. The horses moving in the corral. the grass moving somewhere out past the fence line. This land that Ellen had picked and I had built, and that was still, after all these years, worth something. "Eat your breakfast," she said. I ate my breakfast. She told me about herself over time. Not all at once. She was not a woman who came out in a rush. Over weeks, then months. Over evenings on the porch and mornings at the table and the long stretches of a Sunday when the men had their day and the ranch went quiet, and we would sometimes ride out together to check something in the north pasture or the creek line, not for the ranch but to ride. Her husband's name had been Robert Voss. He had been charming and unreliable in equal measure, and she had loved him hard in the beginning and then less hard, and then with the particular tired steadiness that replaces love when love runs out but loyalty hasn't. The mine had failed. He had blamed the market, the partners, the weather, eventually her. He had not hit her. She was clear about that, as if it were a point of accuracy that needed establishing. He had simply diminished her steadily over 8 years, made her feel small inside a life she had once thought would be large. She had left after the last winter, gone to Clay's because Clay owed Robert a debt, and she had decided she had more right to collect it than her husband did. She said, "I thought I was going somewhere temporary, to wait out whatever was next." And she looked at the north pasture. We were stopped on a small rise with the horses standing easy, the afternoon going golden over the grass. "Clay told me about you," she said, "about your wife. About how you'd run the ranch alone and quietly for 4 years without falling apart." She paused. That was, I realize now, a very specific recommendation. I looked at her. "He was matchmaking," she said with something that was definitely a smile this time, small and dry. "That old fraud." I thought about Clay Dobbins, the wiry saloon keeper I'd known for 20 years with his sharp eyes and his way of knowing more than he let on. I thought about the wire I'd sent him, how specific I'd been about needing someone reliable, someone who could actually do the work, and how he'd sent me Elsa Voss, who could absolutely do the work. "I'll be damned," I said. "He'll expect a letter of thanks. He'll expect no such thing from me." She laughed. Actually laughed, which she did not do often, not a polite laugh but a real one from low in her chest. It startled a bird out of the grass below us. We watched it go. "Harlan," she said when the laugh had settled, "that is the first time I've heard you swear. First time in a while it fit." She shook her head and we rode back in the long afternoon light, the grass moving like water on both sides, the horses easy and sure-footed. The ranch coming up in the distance with its low walls and its west-facing porch and the cottonwoods along the creek beyond it. What I had not expected, and this, looking back, is the thing I would tell any man who found himself in my situation, was how simple it turned out to be. Not easy, but simple. I had carried for 4 years the weight of a man who believes himself used up. Not consciously. I would not have told you that was what I was carrying if you'd asked. I would have said I was fine. That I had the ranch, the work, the men, the days, that I was not a complaining type. But there is a weight in being alone that you stop noticing because it is constant. The way a man stops noticing the smell of his own house or the ache in a joint that has been stiff for years. It is there, continuous background. When it lifted, I noticed. It lifted not in a single moment, but in a series of them, small and ordinary. The plate left on the back of the stove, the sound of her pen in the office. The way she answered when I said something real, not performing a response, not filling space, but actually responding from whatever she was thinking. Her hand on my shoulder that morning in the kitchen. All these things said the same thing, which was, "You are worth this," not in words. In the gesture of a life being willingly arranged around yours and yours willingly arranged around hers because each had decided the other was worth the arrangement. Men of my generation, some of us were not taught to receive that. Were taught instead to provide it, to need nothing, to be the ground that others stood on. I knew men who had starved from that quietly their whole lives. Their wives tried and they couldn't take it in. I had been that way a little. Ellen had told me once near the end that she had sometimes felt she was talking to a wall. Not a hostile wall, a wall that loved her, but a wall. I had not fully understood what she meant until Elsa. Until a woman sat across from me at supper and said, "When are you going to stop being surprised that you're worth something?" And I sat with the question, and found it was the truest question anyone had asked me in my adult life. I did not know the answer then. I was coming to know it. She told me about Ohio one evening in the fall, when it was cool enough to sit on the porch with a fire in the small iron burner I'd dragged out there, the embers throwing a dim orange light, and the sky outside the porch full of stars. She'd grown up near a town called Granville. Her father had been a schoolteacher. Her mother had died when she was 12, and she had taken over the household with a practical competence that, she said, she had never felt as virtue, just as necessity. I was the person who saw what needed to be done, she said. From the time I was 12, that is all I have ever been. That's not all you are. She looked at me. You sound very sure. I'm sure of what I've seen. And what have you seen? I thought about how to say it. I was not a man who had words to spare, generally, but this seemed worth finding the right ones. A person who is careful because she respects things, I said. Not because she's afraid of them. A person who is direct because she's decided that honesty is worth the discomfort of it. A person who is strong in the way that actual strength works, which is quiet and doesn't announce itself. I paused. And a person who, when she decides a thing is worth caring about, cares about it completely. She was quiet for a while. I haven't been told that, she said. Those things. That doesn't mean they weren't true. The fire in the burner popped and resettled. Out beyond the porch in the dark, something in the grass, a night bird, maybe, or just the wind. The stars were very clear and very cold and very far away, the way they are in October, and the warmth of the fire was the warmth of a choice made against the cold. She reached over and took my hand. Not dramatically, just reached over and took it the way you take something that belongs to you. My hand was rough and large and scarred in the particular ways of ranch work, and hers was fine-boned and ink-stained from the ledgers and warm from the fire, and we sat there like that until the fire burned down. We married in February. Not in town, which would have made it a spectacle. Calla Ford would have had opinions, and some of those opinions I didn't want inflicted on her. We married on the ranch. Judge Aldrich came out, which was a grace. The 7 men stood in the yard in their good shirts. Felix had found flowers somewhere, in February, dried things, winter pale, but held together with a length of blue string from the barn. She wore a gray dress I had not seen before, and the silver bracelet on her right wrist. Aldrich was brief. The words were the old words, the ones that have been said over a lot of happiness and a lot of wreckage both, and they meant the same things standing in my yard in February that they had meant anywhere else, which is to say they meant whatever the 2 people in front of each other made them mean. After Dooley, who had turned out to be useful for something, had gotten hold of a fiddle from somewhere, and he played, badly, until Martinez took it from him and played it right, and there was whiskey and cold beef and cornbread, and the men made the kind of noise that men make when they are genuinely glad about something. I stood at the edge of it all with Elsa at my side, her hand in the crook of my arm, and Aldrich came and shook my hand and leaned in and said, in a low voice, "Clay Dobbins should be pleased with himself." "Don't tell him that," I said. "He doesn't need the encouragement." Aldrich laughed and went to get another cup of whiskey. I looked at her. She was watching Martinez play, her head tilted slightly, and the afternoon light, even February light, thin and pale, was doing something to her face that I found I could look at for a long time. She turned and saw me looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Just looking." She looked back at me with those steady eyes, with the directness that I had first registered as assessment, and now understood was simply how she was with things she had decided to trust. "I wasn't warned," she said. "About what?" The corner of her mouth. "About Cowboys." "What about them?" She looked at me a moment longer, and then she leaned in and put her head briefly against my shoulder. Just briefly, just that, and then stood straight again and looked out at the yard where Martinez was playing and the men were laughing, and she said nothing else. She didn't need to. That was 11 years ago. I'm telling this from the porch, which is where I tell most things I bother to tell anymore. The grass is going to seed out to the west. The cottonwoods are full this year. She is in the office. I can hear the drawer, I can hear the pen. Because there are always ledgers, there is always the need for someone to see clearly and say what they see, and she has never once in 11 years told me a number that wasn't true or softened one to spare my feelings. I am 62, and then 65, and then 71, and the ranch has grown and the men have changed, and the first pasture we fenced together is now the 3rd pasture. The fence pushed out further than Ellen ever imagined, standing on that small rise in 1889, telling me where to stop. Dodd Wharton paid the $60. He paid it in 2 installments, as agreed. And after the second installment, he shook my hand, and we have been, since then, the kind of neighbors who are not enemies, which is the best you can do sometimes with a man who started as one. What I know is this. I thought I was a finished thing. A man who had done what he was going to do, loved who he was going to love, built what he was going to build, come as far as he was going to come. The ranch was good and the work was real, and I was not miserable, not truly, but finished. The word I would have used if I had been honest in those 4 years between Ellen and Elsa was *finished. She looked at that and decided otherwise. Not to fix me, not because she needed rescuing or rescuing me, but because she looked at what I was and she decided it was worth continuing. Worth her time, her intelligence, her particular precision, her capacity to care, which once given does not waver. That is what no one warns you about. The way a good woman does that, decides you're worth continuing, and what it does to a man who had stopped expecting it. They talk about young love, the heat of it, the confusion, the certainty that it won't last. What they don't talk about is love that comes at 60, at the end of something, out of nowhere, through a woman with ink on her fingers and money in her left boot who looked at your broken ledgers and your hardened face and your west-facing porch and said, without saying it in so many words, "Yes, this. I'll stay." I heard the drawer close in the office. Then her step, I know it exactly. I will know it when I am old enough to know nothing else, across the floorboards and the sound of the back door, and then she was on the porch. She sat in her chair. She had her book. The evening was going that particular October color again, the one that reminds me every year, without meaning to, of both the things I have lost and the thing I have. She did not look at me. She opened her book. But her hand, that fine-boned, ink-stained, warm hand, came across the space between the chairs and found mine without looking, held it, went back to the book. The grass moved in the last light. The cottonwoods kept their own counsel. I sat there on the porch of the house Ellen chose, and Elsa stayed in, and I held on, just held on, to what my life had become. And